Hey guys, so I'm not going to call this a video response, even though it's partially inspired by a video I saw, but the video didn't really make any arguments. It just made a statement, and the statement wasn't even exactly inaccurate, but I felt like it was misleading and not really conducive to productive discourse, and in a way I feel like this is a problem with the terminology, so I'm going to show you the video and then explain exactly what the problem is I have with the terminology.
Let me define what relativism is. Relativism is the view that there are no objective moral standards that apply to all people at all times and all places. No objective standards of morality that apply in all times to all people and in all places. That is, everything is relative. You hear that, all moral claims are culturally bound.
So the issue I have with this video is also kind of the issue I have with the term moral relativism. And a lot of the time I will try to use the term ethical subjectivism, because I feel like that's more accurate. Because moral relativism would, you'd think, be the idea that morals are relative to time and place and person, whereas ethical subjectivism is the idea that you can make factual statements about ethics. And there was something that happened recently that made me think about exactly what it is that makes someone an ethical subjectivist. And it was someone said to me on the subject of abortion. I obviously said, as I do, that a fetus doesn't really have a value. There's no moral value we can really place on a fetus's life. And they said, but what if you're wrong? And I thought, well, I can't really be. That's like it's like if I said I liked heavy metal and someone said, but what if you're wrong? How can I be wrong about that? And that's the trouble, Well, that's kind of the essence of ethical subjectivism. The fact that there's no such thing as being wrong about the moral value of something, because the moral value of something is determined by humans, and there's nothing that could contradict what a human being finds to be morally relevant that would make them wrong. Now, the trouble I have with the term moral relativism is, firstly, that even if you believe in objective morality, you can still believe that morality is relative. In fact, Christians who almost entirely believe in objective morality are obsessed with moral relativism in support of it, because when you bring up criticism of someone in the past, they will say, but you have to judge them according to the standards of the time that they were raised in. The fact that the Bible condones slavery, or the fact that Catholic theology condones slavery, is defended on the grounds that relative to the time it wasn't immoral. And if you support the ethical teachings of someone who lived over 100 years ago, chances are that they were racist or sexist or classist, and that doesn't mean we discount them, because what else can you expect? So, even if Tao was sexist, it doesn't mean that his ethical theories were bad. It just means his ethical theories should be viewed in the light of the time they were being written for. If you want a good example of this, any political philosophy you read prior to Machiavelli and including Machiavelli will probably have some sexist content in it. Aristotle, obviously, famously has said more than a few sexist things in his books, and yet the majority of people view Aristotle as a reputable ethicist and someone who has a lot to say that is valid on morality, because we do not hold his sexism against him because he was writing at a time when the majority of people were sexist. And in order to acknowledge this fact, you do not need to make any statement on whether or not moral statements have factual value. Now, that's the main point, but also you can technically, although I do think very few people aren't moral relativists, very few people believe that morals can't be viewed relative to the context in which they're around. It's possible to have someone who is an ethical subjectivist and not a moral relativist. You can believe that morals are not factual and still say that Aristotle is categorically immoral for being sexist, even though relative to the time he was writing, that isn't such a big deal. So there's nothing. Moral relativism and ethical subjectivism do appear to be completely different things. And the last point I want to bring up is that facts can be relative. And what I mean by that is, for example, Newton didn't know about all the theories that Einstein and Stephen Hawking and Charles Darwin and other great scientists since Newton have put forward, because Newton was around in the 17th century. So he couldn't have known these things. And we don't call Newton stupid or a bad scientist for not knowing these things, because we acknowledge that relative to the time he was around, he was very smart and he was on the forefront of science for the time he was around. And yet if someone today didn't know the basics of natural science in terms of evolution and physics and chemistry, we think they were really, not necessarily stupid if they weren't that interested in that type of stuff, but certainly pretty stupid if they were a scientist. So you can view someone's understanding of facts through a relative lens. So while I do think it is permissible to use moral relativism and ethical subjectivism as if the two terms are synonymous, because arguably they still can be regarded as synonymous, if you're going to unpack the meaning of those terms and argue that in order to be an ethical subjectivist you must believe that morals are relative to the time and the circumstance that they're around, or if you do believe that, then you must be an ethical subjectivist. If you're going to argue that, then you're not arguing that the two are the same thing. You are pointing out exactly why, in that sense, they cannot be viewed as the same thing. So I realise this video is sort of a bit arguably inconsequential, because if you use the term moral relativism colloquially to mean ethical subjectivism, not believing that moral statements have factual value, then that's fine, but it's just a note that if your criticism of if you mean to criticise ethical subjectivism and you call it moral relativism and then you explain it as if you're talking about the idea that morals are relative, then you are actually misrepresenting ethical subjectivism. Side note, I know I've made this statement before, but I just want to go over it again. A lot of people treat ethical subjectivism as if it is a moral position. Stefan Molyneux does this in particular. The idea that ethical subjectivism is the idea that we ought to view all moral ideas as if they are objectively equal, when it is in fact a factual statement that all ideas are ethically equal whether or not we like it. So you cannot make an appeal to consequence against ethical subjectivism by arguing, if we do this, then Hitler wasn't wrong, because so what? If gravity's real, then people who jump out of buildings die. It's sad. It's just the way it is. So yeah, just that also to consider regarding people who completely misrepresent ethical subjectivism.